Coming up next, it's the Bedfellows on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
It's Adult Swim.
on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next on Cartoon Network.
It's Teletubbies, Cartoon Network.
New series Chamber Code on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Bob's Burgers on Cartoon Network.
This is the Alphabet Pop on Cartoon Network.
Everybody, it's a second be you are funny as you be. Come on, please. All of you, WSYC. Come on, Taiwan. Seriously, everyone's trying. Come on, let's go.
I got hella clothes, ain't no nigga got bad clothes. First on my head, I feel like a airport. And I done, got that nigga that move slow. Ride through the air, I got me that booty hole. What they honey will, we didn't make it to the buzzer room. And I'm piping up.
Presentamos el reembolso.
Mira, Darwin, hemos esperado esto más de 7 meses. No sé, esperamos tanto que ya me quité el cabello.
up next, it's Ari to Support Cereal on Cartoon Network.
Ya viene Amante Slap. Ya viene John Poro.
Up next, it's Jor here on Cartoon Network.
Ve ahí, bombas de Perú.
Mimo, bájale la música. Mimo, que le bajes, te digo.
Ya viene Angry Birds. Ya viene el show de Mr. Ben.
Up next is Battle for Claim Island on Cartoon Network.
Final Five Fosters continue.
至少喺江湖呢班飯堂。
Coming up next, it's 16 on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Har Har Thursdays on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Baby Zoo on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Gay Perk on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Over the Hedge on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Monsters Inc. on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the Angry Birds movie on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's The Wonderful Adventures of Emojinis on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the world of Renius. Renius meets Sub and Zeros on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the adventures of Grandma Lemon. Lemon meets Thomas and Percy on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Fetch with Ruff Ruffman on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Doo-Doo Nursing Rhymes on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Pear on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Grapefruit and Thomas O'Malley on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Toonami on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Romeo and Juliet, Sealed with a Kiss on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Little Bill on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Aqua Teen Hunger Force on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Adult Swim on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's You Are Here on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Beavis and Butthead on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Johnny. Coming up on Cartoon Network, regular show. Coming up next, it's Corn Cup on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Family Guy on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Augie and the Cockroaches on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Sliced on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Unikitty on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's the adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog on Cartoon Network.
Up next, the Powerpuff Girls continues on
Next, Beta Ada Deluda on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's an all-new series, Gumball, on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Hellbenders on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Mau Mau, Heroes of Pure Heart on Cartoon Network. Continuing next, it's more We Bear Bears on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Family Guy on Cartoon
Coming up next, Family Guy.
It seems today that all you see is movies and TV.
But we're in O.
Ja viene fidem superat quod terra bubblegum.
Coming up next, it's Steven 10 on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Mid-X-Apple on Cartoon Network.
Ya viene Mansion Foster para amigos imaginarios.
Coming up next, it's Super Slime Sam on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's The Marshmallow Show on Cartoon Network.
Up next, it's Eric 16 Ultimate Alien on Cartoon Network.
Up next, it's the Problem Solvers.
Coming up next, it's Brewstew on Cartoon Network.